My name is Sarah, and for 50 years, I have been excellent at one thing: being invisible. Not in the way a person is shy or quiet, but in the way a shadow is ignored when the main light is shining. That main light for 5 decades was Max, my younger brother. Max, the golden boy, Max, the ambitious Max, the one who was going to conquer the world and therefore needed to be constantly supported, applauded, and, most critically, financed. I never asked for the spotlight. I simply longed for recognition, but recognition was always a resource reserved solely for him. This deep, persistent desire for love that never came turned me into the perfect victim, the permanent caretaker, and the ultimate financial resource. Our mother, bless her fragile health, ensured this dynamic remained immutable. She was a woman who didn't so much love Max as she invested in him. He was her retirement plan, her social proof, her masterpiece. I was the sturdy, dependable, plain wooden box holding the supplies. When Mother's health began its slow, steady decline 10 years ago, requiring increasingly complex care, that box became the permanent fixture in her life. If you're still here, welcome to Voice of Jenna, a place where stories aren't just told, they're felt. Here, we dive into real emotions, family drama, quiet heartbreaks, unexpected twists, and the moments that change us. So sit back, relax, and let me tell you what happened next. I moved back into the cluttered, cold family home, the same house where I spent my childhood trying to be quiet enough to hear a kind word, and settled into the relentless rhythm of caregiving. My role was thankless, yet essential. I managed the medications, scheduled the physical therapists, cleaned up the inevitable messes, and, most importantly, managed the finances. Or rather, one specific pot of money, the medical endowment fund. This fund wasn't vast, but it was secure. It was sourced from my father's small life insurance policy and designed specifically to cover specialized in-home nursing care or, eventually, a high-quality assisted living facility. There was, to the penny, exactly $127,450 remaining. That money was my lifeline, too. It represented the only true peace I had left, the knowledge that Mother would be taken care of, and Max would be kept at bay, at least financially. Max, naturally, saw it differently. He lived 40 minutes away in a trendy, expensive apartment that he perpetually claimed was just temporary until the next big venture takes off. He had stopped taking care of Mother years ago, professionally announcing that caregiving was not a suitable use of a man's time and talent. His talent, as far as I could tell, was finding creative ways to siphon money for his failed startups, always with a charismatic promise that the return would be exponential. He'd visit once a month for exactly an hour, usually timing his arrival precisely after my bi-weekly transfer of the house allowance to his account, an allowance he was supposed to manage for utilities and supplies, but which inevitably funded his lunch and a new pair of designer sneakers. The pattern of my neglect started early, and by age 50, it was a finely tuned machine. My lifelong role as the financial peacekeeper was the most damning. First sacrifice, my own education. I deferred college to help run Mother's books after Dad died, a loan Max later borrowed and never repaid. Second sacrifice, my career. I never took the risk on a full-time job outside the home because Mother's care always took precedence, leaving me with patchy freelance bookkeeping income and no benefits. Third sacrifice, my emotional well-being. I learned to minimize my own needs, a chronic migraine, a desire for an hour of quiet time, or even a simple expression of frustration, because they were seen as draining attention from the important family projects, i.e. Max. I remember the day Max laid out his toxic worldview in full. We were talking about a new, expensive infusion treatment Mother needed, and I was stressing the need to preserve the fund. Max leaned back, smirked, and delivered the first version of his central thesis. Relax, Sarah. You're here anyway. You handle the practical stuff. That's what women are for. I handle the big picture, the legacy. I am the one who makes the real money. I need resources for that, not for heating this mausoleum. You don't have that stress. That moment crystallized my role. I was the ground crew, and he was the jet pilot, soaring high on my fuel, while I was left to sweep the hangar floor. But that medical endowment fund was my secret strength. I protected it fiercely, knowing it was the only thing standing between Mother's comfort and the abyss of public assistance. I had meticulously reviewed the statements last week. $127,450. Safe. Max was beginning to ask pointed questions about the fund's liquidity, questions he had never bothered with before. He claimed he had a guaranteed, short-term investment that would double the fund in 6 weeks. I saw the request for what it was, a veiled attempt to hijack the money. I had refused, calmly, rationally, stating the fund's specific legal purpose. His charming veneer had cracked for a second, revealing a cold, calculating rage that made the air in the sick room suddenly feel very thin. I knew then a storm was coming, and this time, it wouldn't be just a demand for a loan, it would be a takeover bid. My only mistake was underestimating the lengths he would go to justify his greed. Max's latest venture had just imploded, silently, without the dramatic fanfare of his previous failures. I saw the eviction notice slipped under his door when I went to drop off some of Mother's old furniture. He was desperate. And desperate Max was the most dangerous Max of all. I should have checked the bank statement that night, but the sheer exhaustion of lifting Mother for the evening care had left me physically drained. I went to bed instead, the cold weight of the savings account balance the only thing allowing me to sleep. But tomorrow, I knew I would need to access the account to pay the quarterly nursing agency fees. Tomorrow, the quiet terror I had lived with for years would either be proven false or become terrifyingly real. The morning arrived, bringing with it the cold, unyielding clarity of necessity. The nursing agency invoice for the quarter, a sharp, precise figure of $8,500, lay on the counter, demanding attention. This was the moment of truth. I needed to log into the bank and transfer the funds from the medical endowment fund. After the exhaustion of the previous night and Max's thinly veiled threat, the knot in my stomach was cinched tight. I brewed a cup of coffee strong enough to mask the bitter taste of anxiety and sat down at the old oak desk, the very piece of furniture where my father taught me how to balance a ledger. I logged into the online portal, navigating past the general savings and into the secure endowment account. The screen loaded, and the blood drained from my face. The current balance was not $127,450. It was $4,923.50. I stared at the number, feeling a slow, crushing pressure build in my chest, squeezing the air out. It wasn't possible. I had checked it last week. I refreshed the page, blinked hard, and checked again. The balance was immutable. I clicked on the transaction history, my hands shaking so badly I had to steady my wrist with the other. There, on 3 consecutive days, were 3 large, rounded transfers: $40,000, $40,000, and $42,526.50. They were all labeled ambiguously: financial asset reallocation. I knew instantly, without needing the name of the recipient, that Max had done it. He had hijacked the fund. He hadn't asked for a loan. He had executed a complete takeover, leaving behind only the scraps needed to make it look like an active, though nearly depleted, account. The sudden shock cleared the fog of years of enabling. This wasn't a mistake. It was an act of calculated cruelty, not just against me, but against Mother. That $8,500 invoice was now a legal impossibility. I had $4,923.50. Mother's care was now entirely compromised. This financial violation coincided with a significant deterioration in Mother's condition. This was my catalyst. Just 3 days prior, the doctor had delivered the news. Mother's neurological state was worsening rapidly, and she would soon require full-time, round-the-clock specialized nursing. The current agency was no longer equipped to handle the need. This new level of care, the non-negotiable next step, was estimated to cost between $12,000 and $15,000 per month. The Medical Endowment Fund, the $127,450, was explicitly earmarked for this transition. That money was my escape route, the knowledge that I wouldn't have to bankrupt myself or, worse, physically struggle with a task far beyond my capabilities. My immediate new purpose, my non-negotiable goal, was crystallized: protect Mother's dignity and secure her care. I had to confront Max, but first I needed proof. I immediately called the bank. It took 2 hours, involving hold music that mocked my rising panic, until I finally spoke to a branch manager. The manager, a woman named Ms. Chun, pulled up the records. Max, who had been granted signing authority years ago for emergency medical decisions, had exploited a loophole. He presented documents to the bank claiming the funds were being moved into a higher-yield, family-managed investment vehicle specifically approved by the power of attorney. He had used the language of responsibility to commit an act of larceny. I hung up the phone, the rage finally beginning to burn away the decades of fear. It wasn't just the money, it was the sheer audacity, the cold, professional lie. Max called that afternoon, before I could reach him. His voice was overly cheerful, almost vibrating with suppressed excitement. "Well, Sarah Bear," he purred, using the sickly childhood nickname, "I assume you've checked the portfolio? Took care of those idle funds. They're working for us now. Just like I said. Big picture." I could feel the anger vibrating in my voice, but I forced it down into a deadly calm. "Max, I just spoke to the bank. What you did was not a reallocation. It was a theft. And you left us with $4,000 when we need to pay the agency $8,000 tomorrow." Max's cheerful facade shattered. The voice that came back was instantly cold and defensive. This was one of the microaggressions I had become accustomed to, the immediate emotional retaliation that shut down any legitimate complaint. "A theft? Don't be dramatic, Sarah. That money was sitting there, losing value. I used my expertise, my actual financial talent, to leverage it. I am trying to build a future, not just sit on a stagnant pile of cash like some ancient librarian. I told you you handle the practical stuff. If you'd been on top of the nursing fees, we wouldn't have this problem. This is a timing issue, not a Max issue." He immediately shifted the blame, a classic, infuriating pattern. He made the catastrophic mistake, and my inability to predict his malice was somehow my failing. "The bank manager confirmed you used the funds for an unauthorized personal transaction, Max. They are not in a portfolio. They are gone. Mother needs full-time nursing. We don't have the money for her transition now." He paused, a chilling, calculated silence. Then he delivered his final shot for the day, a new, sharp microaggression designed to inflict maximum pain and control. "You know what, Sarah? You're exhausted. You're clearly panicking and making up numbers. That's what happens when you isolate yourself in that house. I think it's time I stepped in and took over the power of attorney entirely. For Mother's sake, and honestly for yours. I'll handle the money and the care from now on. You just rest." The implication was clear. My failure to enable was proof of my incompetence. I was so used to being the shadow, I didn't know how to fight the main light. He had just threatened to take my only remaining dignity, my role as Mother's primary caregiver, and transfer all legal power to himself. He hung up before I could process the true weight of that threat. I was left alone in the quiet, the invoice still glaring at me, the $4,923.50 screaming its uselessness. I felt the decades of silent victimization collapsing around me, replaced by a single, terrifying truth. If I did nothing, Max would not only steal the rest of the money, he would destroy my life and condemn Mother to substandard care. I knew then that the storm Max predicted wasn't coming. It was here. And it was time for the quiet librarian to put down the books and pick up a sword. The confrontation I expected over the phone in Chapter 2 became a terrifying reality less than 12 hours later. Max didn't wait for my legal paperwork or my response. He acted, leveraging the decades of familial deference he was used to. He arrived without calling, using the spare key he still had. The moment he walked into the house, the atmosphere shifted from quiet, sickroom anxiety to a sharp, hostile invasion. He wasn't wearing his usual carefully rehearsed charm. His face was tight with desperation and the righteous indignation of a person who believes they are being denied what is fundamentally theirs. He walked past me, ignoring my stiff, shocked presence in the hallway, and marched directly into Mother's bedroom, which I had carefully made into a temporary care unit. "Mother," Max announced loudly, pulling a chair right next to her bed. "We have a problem." Sarah is hysterical. She's been neglecting the finances, and it's time I took over the power of attorney completely. "You understand that, right?" Mother, whose lucidity was now intermittent but whose loyalty to Max was absolute, gave a weak, dismissive nod in my direction. "Sarah worries too much, Max. She always does." That was the immediate family paralysis, the single, dismissive line that rendered my decades of care and Max's massive theft utterly invisible. I felt the familiar, searing pain of being negated by the two people I had sacrificed everything for. The physical betrayal was nothing compared to the emotional wound inflicted by her quiet endorsement. I followed him into the room, gripping the chair railing for support. "You will not do that, Max. You stole over $120,000 from her medical fund. You left us without the means to pay for the care the doctor says she needs right now. That is financial exploitation." Max spun on me, his eyes glinting with pure fury. This was the shocking ACT/incident, the moment he abandoned all pretense of shared responsibility. He pulled a thick, official-looking envelope out of his jacket pocket, a pre-signed document from his lawyer, and slammed it down onto the bedside table, scattering Mother's medications. "This is what I'm doing," he spat. "I'm protecting what's ours. You don't understand responsibility, Sarah. You're a perpetual victim living in the past. You're talking about nursing fees. I'm talking about multi-generational wealth." He then delivered his full, toxic justification, the absolute bedrock of his entitlement and the worldview that had shackled me for 50 years. He leaned over the bed, not looking at Mother, but driving the words at me like weapons. "You want to know why I can snatch the money and still walk in here and take charge? You want to know why this is my burden and your duty?" Max's voice dropped to a low, chilling register, revealing the core truth of his poison. "It's because I am the man. I am the one who has to create the legacy, the public success. That's my role. Your role, Sarah, is supporting the family and handling the logistics. That is what women are for. I am superior because I generate the value. Therefore, I get to decide how the value is allocated. I am not responsible for the details, and I am certainly not responsible for managing your anxiety about a few $1,000s. You take care of the logistics, I take care of the big picture. That is the natural order." Thesis line: he is man, so that's why he is superior and can snatch all the money, but he is not responsible for anything. The air thickened with the weight of that statement. It was the toxic belief that had defined our family structure. His superiority justified my servitude. The sheer clarity of the abuse finally broke through my decades of cognitive dissonance. It wasn't just about the money. It was about Max's inherent right, as he saw it, to control my life and Mother's future. I felt a monumental shift. The shame and paralyzing fear that usually accompanied his attacks vanished, replaced by an ice-cold focus. My non-negotiable goal, protect Mother's dignity and secure her care, demanded immediate action. If Max took the POA, he would transfer the house's deed to himself and throw Mother into the cheapest available facility, leaving me legally and financially ruined. I grabbed the bedside telephone and dialed 911. Max, stunned by the audacity of my sudden boundary, paused, the pre-signed POA document still clutched in his hand. "Sarah, what the hell are you doing? Hang up that phone." I ignored him, stating my name and address calmly. "I am reporting an attempted theft and trespass by a family member who is attempting to coerce an elderly, dependent relative into signing over power of attorney. He is currently in the room." Max lunged, not for me, but for the document, shoving it back into his pocket. He realized that a 911 call meant police, and police meant questions about the document and potentially the stolen funds. The sight of his entitled panic, the golden boy realizing that the rules didn't stop at his family's front door, was the single most validating thing I had experienced in 50 years. He scrambled out of the room, throwing one last, venomous threat over his shoulder. "You'll regret this, Sarah. You just ended your life." He was wrong. He hadn't ended my life. He had ended the life of the invisible, victimized Sarah, and she was not coming back. I stood in the quiet room, the telephone receiver still warm in my hand, staring at the empty space where Max had stood. The betrayal was complete, and the pain was absolute, but the clarity was blinding. I was officially alone, but I was finally free to fight for myself and for Mother's dignity, without the weight of enabling him. This was my wound, raw and agonizing, but it was also the first step on the road to wisdom. The immediate aftermath of the 911 call was chaotic, yet transformative. The police arrived, and though Max had already fled, speeding out of the driveway before the cruiser lights even flashed on the street, their presence provided an anchor of external, objective reality. The young officer, having listened to my trembling account of the POA attempt and the missing funds, looked at me not with judgment, but with professional concern. "Ma'am, based on what you've described, you need to file a formal police report about the theft and consult with an elder law attorney immediately. The unauthorized use of funds by someone with POA access, especially when it directly impacts the dependent's care, is serious." The words elder law attorney and theft felt like cold, hard stones of validation. This wasn't a family drama, it was a crime. This realization was my strategic retreat, not running away, but running toward legal clarity and safety. My first act of liberation was a small, practical one. I called a locksmith and had Max's spare key officially destroyed. I changed the house alarm codes, and then, most crucially, I used the remaining $4,923.50 to pay for 2 weeks of emergency, specialized nursing care. It wasn't enough, but it bought me time, the most precious commodity I had left. The threats, however, began almost immediately. Max couldn't attack me physically now that a police report was filed, so he attacked my reputation, leveraging the family dynamic he knew so well. The first call came from my cousin, Lisa, Mother's second favorite niece, an hour after the police left. Lisa adopted the sickly sweet, concerned tone of the passive antagonist/enabler. "Sarah, I just spoke to Max. He's beside himself. He said you had a massive breakdown, hysterically screaming and yelling about imaginary money. He's worried about you, sweetie. And poor Aunt Eleanor, he said you called the police on him in front of her. Are you okay? You need to calm down, Sarah. He's just trying to help the family." This was the first wave of attack, the threat to destroy my credibility. Max was painting me as the mentally unstable aggressor, the hysterical woman who was destroying the family harmony. I felt the decades-old training to apologize, to smooth things over, to retreat into my shadow role. But the image of the police officer's serious face, the sight of Max's entitled panic, held me steady. "Lisa," I said, my voice firm despite the tremor in my hand, "I did not have a breakdown. Max stole over $120,000 from Mother's medical fund, leaving her without the care she desperately needs. He then attempted to coerce her into signing over the full power of attorney. I reported attempted theft and trespass. This is not hysteria. This is financial necessity. I have a police report number, and you can call the bank for the transaction records. If you choose to believe Max's story, that is your choice, but I will not engage with his lies." I hung up before she could offer a word of defense. The physical act of cutting off the conversation felt like severing a parasitic cord. The second, and more painful, threat came from Mother herself, hours later. Max had clearly put her up to it. Her voice was weak, slow, and laced with manipulative disappointment. "Sarah," she whispered, the familiar tone of long-suffering motherhood, "Max is so upset. Why are you doing this to us? You're tearing the family apart over money. He's a man, he has big plans. This is your home, Sarah. You should be protecting it, not fighting in it. Max says if you keep this up, he'll have to sell the house to cover the losses you've caused. Think about your roof over your head, Sarah. You won't survive out there alone." This was the threat to my reputation and my physical survival. Max was leveraging the house, the only true asset I had access to, as leverage. He implied that my refusal to enable him would directly lead to my homelessness. I walked to the front window, staring at the darkened street. I realized that my perceived vulnerability, my lack of a career, my quiet life, was Max's greatest weapon. He genuinely believed that taking away my roof would instantly break me. But the old Sarah was gone. I looked at the dark wood of the front door, remembering Max's hand slamming the POA document onto Mother's table. I had nothing left to lose. My dignity was already gone. My savings were gone. All that remained was my non-negotiable goal: protect Mother's dignity and secure her care. I called the elder law attorney recommended by the police officer, making the first proactive, professional decision of my life. I scheduled an appointment for the next morning. I needed facts, not feelings. I needed legal armor. Max had thrown the gauntlet down, using shame and social coercion. I was about to pick it up, armed with the precise language of the law. Max had spent his life dealing with the big picture. I was about to show him that sometimes the only thing that matters is the meticulous, undeniable detail. The appointment with the elder law attorney, Ms. Davies, was the first time in 50 years I felt truly seen, not as a reflection of Max's needs or Mother's demands, but as an independent entity seeking justice. Ms. Davies was sharp, professional, and radiated a calming, no-nonsense confidence. She listened to my entire story: the decades of enabling, the sudden theft, the thesis line about Max's superiority, and the attempted POA takeover, without a single emotional judgment. When I finished, trembling, she nodded slowly. "Sarah, what your brother has done is not just unethical. It is a textbook case of elder financial exploitation, compounded by attempted coercion. His motive is clear. He wants the assets, and he wants to transfer the burden of care to you entirely, which is why he filed to strip you of credibility. Your immediate reaction, calling the police, was the correct one. You established a legal baseline." Her validation was powerful, pulling me further out of the quicksand of family shame. "But my mother," I stammered. She defended him. She said I was hysterical. Ms. Davies leaned forward. "That's irrelevant to the law. We are dealing with facts. The moment Max acted on his own, exploiting his POA access for personal gain rather than the dependent's well-being, he violated his fiduciary duty. We need to prove this violation meticulously. We need to move this from a family drama into a financial crime." She then outlined the crucial legal strategy: securing the immediate protection of Mother's care needs and simultaneously building an airtight case for the revocation of Max's power of attorney and the recovery of the stolen funds. "To do that," Ms. Davies said, tapping a pen on her legal pad, "we need an audit. Not just the bank statements, Sarah. We need a detailed, clinical log of every financial transaction you have managed for Max or Mother over the last decade. We need to quantify the cost of your victimization. We need to turn your shame into a spreadsheet." This was the start of the audit, a process that became a form of therapy. I spent the next 3 days in a furious, meticulous effort, sifting through ancient bank statements, utility bills, and handwritten ledgers. I created a spreadsheet with cold, hard columns: date, description, purpose, amount, and Max's benefit. I tracked the 3 massive, recent transfers totaling $122,526.50. But I didn't stop there. I added the loans Max never repaid, my college fund, $15,000. I added the utilities I covered when Max was between ventures, $8,000. I quantified the supplies and care Max was supposed to manage with the allowance I transferred to him, but clearly never did, $12,000. I even, painstakingly, added the estimated cost of the lost salary and benefits from the career I sacrificed to stay home, calculating the 10-year opportunity cost. That number alone was devastating. When I finished compiling the data, the final figure was staggering. Beyond the medical endowment theft, I calculated Max had directly and indirectly drained $248,300 from the family over 10 years, counting only the hard cash and direct opportunity cost. The initial theft was a fraction of the true damage. Max's big picture ambition had been funded entirely by my shadow labor and sacrifice. The spreadsheet was my first true act of empowerment. It was objective. It was undeniable. It was a tangible rebuttal to Max's thesis that I was just hysterical and not responsible for the big picture. The big picture, laid out in 12-point Arial font, was that Max was a financial black hole. Ms. Davies' office also provided a crucial piece of validation from another source, a therapist who specialized in family abuse, Dr. Anya Sharma. I had an emergency session with her, and she listened to the story of the POA attempt and Max's thesis line. Dr. Sharma nodded knowingly. What Max articulated is a common dynamic in these situations. He elevates himself with a toxic justification, I am superior / a man / the legacy, to rationalize his exploitation. Your role, Sarah, was to internalize that justification. When you fought back, you didn't just challenge the money, you challenged his entire identity. That is why his response was so extreme. What do I do about Mother? I asked, the fear still lingering. She always sides with him. We focus on safety, Dr. Sharma advised. We ensure her physical needs are met and let the court handle the finances. For your emotional health, you must recognize that your relationship with them is not based on love, but on coercion. You have to mourn the mother and brother you never had, and protect the life you still can. Leaving the attorneys and the therapists' offices, I felt armored. I carried the audit, 40 pages of pristine, damning detail. The old feeling of being a victim was hardening into the resolve of a litigant. Max had relied on shame, emotional blackmail, and the toxic thesis to control me. I was now armed with the exact opposite: objective truth and legal precision. Max had opened the floodgates. I was about to show him that meticulous detail, the stuff he claimed was beneath him, was the only thing that mattered now. The momentum from compiling the audit was intoxicating. I felt the cold, powerful energy of fact replacing the hot, paralyzing feeling of shame. Ms. Davies had immediately filed the petition to freeze Max's assets and revoke his power of attorney, leveraging the bank statements and the documented police call. For the first time, I felt like the predator, not the prey. But Max, the golden boy, was not used to losing. He operated on the assumption that the system, much like our family, would always bend to his entitlement. He had one last card to play, one he had buried years ago, waiting for a moment of critical desperation. 3 days after we filed the petition, a certified letter arrived from Max's own lawyer. It wasn't a defense against the fraud allegations. It was a preemptive counterstrike designed to disarm me completely. I opened the document in Ms. Davies' office. It was a waiver of claim I had signed 5 years ago, shortly after Mother first fell ill. At the time, Max had framed it as an administrative necessity. Sarah, he'd said smoothly, we need to secure Mother's long-term care fund against any future, frivolous lawsuits. It's just a standard legal firewall. Sign this, and it ensures that if anything ever happens to Mother's primary asset, the house, you and I can't sue each other over the division of property. It keeps the house solely in Mother's name for tax purposes. It sounded responsible. It sounded like Max taking care of the big picture. I, the logistical woman, had signed it without reading the fine print, trusting his superior judgment. Ms. Davies pointed to a specific clause, her face grave. Sarah, this isn't just a tax waiver. This document explicitly states that in the event of Mother being placed into long-term care, which, as the doctor confirmed, is imminent, you legally forfeit any claim, current or future, to the family home as an offset for your caregiving duties. Essentially, you signed away your right to compensation for the last 10 years of care, making your contribution legally invisible. The air left the room. My meticulous audit, quantifying my $248,300 worth of sacrifice, suddenly felt weightless. Max's counterfiling included this waiver, paired with a motion to force the immediate sale of the family home to cover the unexpected shortfalls in the medical endowment fund, the funds he himself had stolen, claiming the house sale was necessary for Mother's care. His plan was horrifyingly clear. By stealing the cash, Max created the emergency. By presenting this waiver, he prevented me from offsetting my 10 years of labor against the value of the house. He was forcing the sale, ensuring I would receive nothing, and making me homeless, all under the guise of caring for Mother. Max would pocket the remaining equity, and I would be left on the street, having physically and emotionally paid for a home I had no legal claim to. He used the language of protection to commit an act of complete divestment. I whispered, the nausea returning. This wasn't just theft, it was enslavement. Ms. Davies shook her head. He's brilliant and cold, Sarah. He knew the house was your anchor. He knew you'd never take a salary for caring for your own mother. By making your labor invisible, he secured the greatest asset for himself. The trap, the forgotten legal document, the waiver of claim, was Max's checkmate. It didn't just hurt, it revealed the terrifying depth of his long-term planning. 5 years ago, he had already engineered my financial collapse, securing his ultimate goal, eliminating the competition for the last remaining significant asset. I looked at the waiver, a piece of paper with my own signature on it, legitimizing my own undoing. My mind raced backward to the moment I signed it, completely trusting his supposed superior male logic. Max's toxic justification about being the man wasn't just a boast, it was a legal tool. A cold, hard terror seized me. If I lost the house, I wouldn't just be poor, I would be destitute. I had no savings, no career, and now no home. I had poured my entire life into that house, only to realize I had legally surrendered every right to it 5 years ago. Ms. Davies looked at me, her face showing genuine concern. We can argue duress, Sarah, but this is a serious obstacle. It means we have to find the money somewhere else. We need to secure the funds to move your mother into that facility, and quickly, or Max will win control of the house. The weight of the last 5 years of care pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. All my sacrifices, all my love, reduced to a signature on a document that made me legally worthless. The question slammed into me with sickening force. How much control have I already surrendered? Was every piece of stability I thought I had just another part of Max's long-term play? I realized then that my physical safety was predicated entirely on winning this legal fight, because Max would not stop until he had nothing left to take. The waiver of claim was a calculated punch to the gut, but it also contained a fatal flaw. It relied entirely on my submission. Max assumed that the fear of homelessness would instantly reduce me to the invisible shadow I once was. He expected me to cave, drop the lawsuit, and beg him for mercy. Instead, the waiver only hardened my resolve. Ms. Davies worked quickly, securing an emergency short-term line of credit using the house as collateral, a desperate measure, but one necessary to cover the immediate fees for a high-quality care facility for Mother. Our strategic move was to immediately transfer Mother to the facility. This action would remove Max's primary pretense for access and his claim that I was failing in her care. The day the transfer team arrived was tense, but focused. Moving Mother was a logistical symphony I had orchestrated flawlessly. Once she was safely settled, the house felt monumentally empty, yet incredibly liberating. For the first time in 10 years, I was truly alone. Max, however, sensed his window of control closing. He had called repeatedly, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails demanding to know where Mother was. I followed Ms. Davies' advice. 0 contact. The silence was driving him mad, but it was also giving him time to plan a last-ditch, extra-legal assault. It happened late that evening, 2 days after Mother's transfer. I was sitting at the oak desk, finalizing the documentation for the facility, when I heard a loud, violent shuddering at the back door. Max wasn't using the key I had revoked. He was forcing entry. He used a crowbar to pry the old deadbolt, the loud, grinding sound of wood splintering shattering the sanctity of my sanctuary/home. He burst into the kitchen, his face a mask of sweating, entitled rage. He hadn't expected the house to be empty, and the sight of the stripped-down, quiet care room only fueled his fury. "Where is she, Sarah? Where did you hide her?" he roared, stomping into the hallway. "You have no right to do this. I am the power of attorney. You can't make executive decisions without me." He stopped directly in front of me, his physical presence dominating the small space, violating the boundary of my personal sphere. This was the violation, the physical climax of the conflict. He wasn't there to talk, He was there to intimidate, to recover the POA document, or to terrorize me into retreat. I did not flinch. I had anticipated this, thanks to Ms. Davies' firm instruction. When the emotional abuser runs out of legal maneuvering, they resort to physical intimidation. Do not engage. Document everything. I calmly reached for the small, voice-activated recorder hidden beneath the desk blotter, triggering it with a silent tap. Then I lifted my phone, not to call the police immediately, but to activate the live video feed. I held it up, pointed directly at him. "Max," I stated, my voice steady, cold, and entirely devoid of the decades of fear he was accustomed to. "Mother is safe in the Sunny Meadows facility. The funds were secured by a short-term loan. You are currently trespassing. You damaged the back door to force entry. I already have an active police report filed against you for attempted coercion and financial fraud. Every word you say is being recorded and sent live to my attorney." The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Max, who had spent his life operating in the shadowy, undocumented space of family politics, was paralyzed by the light of objective documentation. His entitlement evaporated, replaced by the terror of legal consequence. He was used to the security of my silence. He was not used to the legal threat of the law being applied to him. "You're bluffing," he sneered, but his eyes darted from the phone camera to the door. "I am not," I countered, standing up slowly. "I have filed an injunction for a permanent restraining order based on the initial POA attempt and the subsequent theft. Breaking and entering into the property is an immediate, egregious violation of the preliminary filing. I will call 911 right now if you take one step closer to me or to this desk." He saw the unwavering resolution in my eyes, the cold, hard logic that the victimized Sarah never possessed. He knew I was serious. He backed away slowly, his chest heaving, his pride warring with his fear of prison time. "You have destroyed this family, Sarah," he snarled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You have ruined my life, and you will regret fighting me. You will be alone, and you will be homeless. You are nothing without this family's support." He turned and stormed back toward the splintered back door, slamming it shut behind him, leaving silence in his wake. The police arrived 10 minutes later, responding to the silent alarm I had triggered the moment he entered the house. They took Max's car details, documented the door damage, and confirmed my statement. The officer looked at me. "You handled that perfectly, ma'am. You established your boundary, documented the invasion, and defended your space. This will be critical evidence for the restraining order." As they left, I surveyed the damage, a broken doorframe, splintered wood, and the lingering scent of Max's desperation. But the silence that followed was triumphant. I had held the line. I had successfully defended my sanctuary using the only tools that ever mattered to Max: documentation and the law. He had violated my home, but he had failed to violate my resolve. I had proven that I was no longer afraid of his physical presence or his threats of abandonment. The fight was still going, but I had won the battle for my own safety. The morning after the break-in, the quiet house was charged with a new, fierce energy. I was no longer cleaning up Max's messes. I was cleaning up the remnants of my own life, rebuilding it from the studs. The police report on the trespass was filed, adding yet another layer of objective proof to Max's volatility. Max's final attempt at coercion came not through legal paperwork, but through an uncontrolled, venomous phone call from a block number. I recognized the frantic, entitled pitch of his voice instantly. "You've sealed your fate, Sarah. The police confirmed you moved mother. You are in violation of every family agreement we ever made. You're isolated, you're old, and now you're destroying the only asset you have left, the house, to stick mother in some overpriced nursing home. How long until that short-term loan bankrupts you? A year? 6 months? You should have let me handle it. I had a way out." He was still operating under the assumption that I needed his validation, his approval, or his vision of the big picture. He was desperately trying to pull me back into the narrative where he was the savior and I was the hysterical impediment. I took a deep breath, and the decades of silent acquiescence, the constant longing for approval, fell away. I saw him clearly, a terrified child wrapped in the armor of toxic entitlement. This was my moment to deliver the antithesis, the counter-thesis that didn't just reject his actions, but rejected his entire, abusive philosophy. "You have no way out, Max," I said, my voice steady and low. "Because the only thing you know how to do is destroy what others build. You keep talking about legacy, but all you leave behind are debts and broken trust. You talk about superiority, but you use fraud to achieve what honest work should earn." I leaned into the phone, delivering the final, liberating blow that shattered his core justification. "My worth is in the work and the integrity I uphold. I take responsibility for my life now, for mother's dignity, and for the security of my home. That is real value. You, Max, demanded all the power but claimed zero responsibility. You are not superior. You are a criminal. And now, you are responsible for your own ruin." Antithesis line. "My worth is in the work and the integrity I uphold. I take responsibility for my life now. You, Max, are responsible for your own ruin." The silence on his end was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It wasn't the silence of fear, but the silence of absolute, philosophical defeat. His worldview was predicated on my weakness. When my weakness vanished, his power dissolved. He muttered a quick, incoherent threat and hung up. I knew that exchange was the end of the emotional war. But Ms. Davies had warned me. When abusers lose their emotional leverage, they turn to the hardest available weapon. Max's retaliation was swift and savage, directed at the only action that could be legally spun against me. Later that afternoon, a process server delivered an official, thick manila envelope. I opened it with shaking hands in front of the oak desk. It wasn't the final restraining order, or a simple civil motion. It was a formal criminal complaint. Max had moved beyond the civil court. He was using his financial acumen for evil one last time. The complaint detailed that I, Sarah, had acted without the proper and sole power of attorney, which he still claimed was valid, despite the revocation filing, to seize a family asset, the house, and had illegally embezzled the funds from the loan by using the house as collateral. He framed my desperate, life-saving action of securing the short-term loan for mother's care as a premeditated act of theft and fraud committed against the estate. He had filed an official criminal complaint, not just against my actions, but against me, the primary caregiver. He had literally inverted the reality of the crime. I dropped the document onto the desk, the paper fluttering down like a death sentence. Max's final, existential threat was clear. If he couldn't win the house, he would ensure I paid for the moral victory with my freedom. He wasn't just trying to make me homeless anymore, he was trying to make me a felon. I had stepped out of the shadow and into the light of responsibility. Max's response was to throw a spotlight on me, but only to frame me in the dock. The fight had ceased to be about money or a house. It was about whether I would spend the rest of my life in a prison of my own making, or a prison constructed by his final, desperate lie. The hearing was not a dramatic courtroom battle, but a tense, closed-door mediation session presided over by a magistrate, a necessary step to address Max's frivolous, yet paralyzing, criminal complaint and finalize the revocation of his power of attorney. The stakes, however, felt like life or death. If the magistrate even entertained Max's claim of embezzlement, my life was over. I sat beside Ms. Davies, wearing a simple, professional suit, my own armor. Across the table, Max was impeccably dressed, radiating manufactured sincerity, his lawyer beside him attempting to spin the narrative, a concerned brother trying to save the estate from a hysterical, financially incompetent sister. The magistrate looked sternly at the stack of documents. Max's lawyer launched into the narrative. Miss Sarah's desperate and unauthorized loan, taken against a primary asset, was an act of embezzlement, driven by paranoia. My client, Max, was simply reallocating funds into a safe investment vehicle, and his actions were entirely within his fiduciary rights as POA. Max nodded solemnly, embodying the wronged man. Ms. Davies then took over, and it was a masterpiece of clinical dismantling. She didn't argue emotion. She argued chronology. Your Honor, we're dealing with a classic case of projection and financial inversion. Mr. Max's actions must be viewed in sequence. Max's own bank records, which we provided in the audit, show his 3 unauthorized personal transfers, totaling $122,526.50, which depleted the medical endowment fund, occurred on May 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. That is the theft. Ms. Sarah's subsequent emergency loan, used to secure mother's care, occurred on May 10th. Ms. Sarah was forced to incur debt to rectify the financial crime Mr. Max committed a week earlier. Furthermore, we submit the audio and police report of May 12th, showing Mr. Max attempting to physically break into the home and coerce Ms. Sarah, which clearly demonstrates a pattern of abuse when his financial control was challenged. Ms. Davies then used the waiver of claim, the very document Max used to threaten my homelessness, against him. Mr. Max relied on this waiver to make Ms. Sarah's 10 years of caregiving legally invisible, setting the stage for him to force the sale of the house and pocket the remaining equity. His intent was never to care for the estate, but to seize it. The magistrate leaned back, clearly unimpressed with Max's performance. The facts are clear, counsel. The money was taken by your client before Ms. Sarah took any action. The criminal complaint is baseless and appears to be retaliatory. It is dismissed. The word dismissed was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. Max's face went white, his carefully constructed composure finally crumbling into a look of pure, impotent hatred. The second part of the hearing focused on the revocation of POA and Max's immediate restitution. To solidify the victory, Ms. Davies introduced my emotional witness, Ms. Eleanor Vance, the head administrator from the high-quality nursing agency that Mother had been transferred to. Ms. Vance provided the crucial, objective emotional validation. Ms. Vance testified calmly. On May 5th, we were forced to notify Ms. Sarah that our services would be terminated due to a lack of payment from the family fund, which was critical given Mrs. Eleanor's escalating needs. Ms. Sarah immediately secured emergency funding and moved Mrs. Eleanor into our higher-tier facility, ensuring continuous, high-quality care. Conversely, Mr. Max called us repeatedly, not to ask about his mother's health, but to aggressively demand to know the facility's price structure, arguing that Ms. Sarah was wasting money. His concern was entirely financial and entirely focused on asset protection, not patient care. This testimony was the final nail. It confirmed that the protagonist was the protector and the antagonist was the exploiter, entirely driven by the money, even in a professional setting. Max's thesis line, that his superiority justified his disregard for responsibility, was shattered by the simple testimony of a neutral witness. The magistrate made the final ruling. Max's power of attorney was permanently revoked. A freezing order was placed on his remaining assets, and he was ordered to begin a structured repayment plan for the $122,526.50, plus court costs. The repayment was immediately designated to fund Mother's long-term care, ensuring Max would now be forced to contribute to the very burden he tried to shunt onto me. Walking out of the mediation, I wasn't just Sarah. I was a victor. I had not just won a case. I had secured my autonomy. Max was gone, his power dismantled, and the financial responsibility for Mother was legally transferred away from him and into a protective trust, funded by his forced restitution. The weight of his toxic presence was finally lifted, leaving me with a sense of profound, quiet catharsis. The emotional war was over, and the victim had emerged as the responsible, empowered survivor. The final ruling was the end of the war, but the true victory was the profound, quiet change in my own existence. The house, which had been a cage of duty for 10 years, suddenly felt like a clean, blank slate. The emergency loan was now manageable, offset by the structured payments Max was legally forced to make. With Mother permanently and safely situated in the facility, her expenses secured by the trust funded by Max's restitution, my life was entirely my own. My symbolic act of separation was rooted in the very asset Max coveted. I put the family home up for sale, not because I was forced to, but because I chose to. That house was stained by the toxic thesis line, by the expectation of my servitude, and by the constant absence of love. I didn't want to live in a monument to my neglect. I needed a home that was a celebration of my future, not a memory of my past. The sale was swift, and with the equity, I paid off the small debt from the emergency loan and established a solid personal savings account. For the first time, my bank account belonged solely to me. I had achieved true financial independence, forged not through Max's failed, big-picture schemes, but through my own meticulous, responsible action. I didn't move far, but the distance was seismic. I bought a small, bright condo near the city center, a place full of light and life, close to community centers and, ironically, close to a major elder law center. My new life/vivid list began immediately. I enrolled in part-time bookkeeping courses to update my skills and start a small, legitimate freelance business. I joined a book club. The simple, genuine joy of discussing literature with people who valued my opinion, not my wallet, was intoxicating. I started swimming laps at the local pool, reclaiming my physical strength that had been eroded by caregiving. I never heard from Max again. The restraining order and the court-ordered restitution payments acted as a permanent, cold buffer. I heard from Lisa that Max had been forced to take a low-level sales job to meet his repayment obligations and that the loss of his legacy had destroyed him socially. He was forced to become the logistical worker he had always sneered at. Mother remained at Sunny Meadows. I visited her weekly. The dynamic hadn't changed. She still asked about Max first and still expressed quiet disappointment that I had ruined the family. But those words no longer pierced me. I mourned the mother I never had, but I cherished the mother I had protected. I performed my duty with love and responsibility, unburdened by the expectation of gratitude. One evening, sitting on my new balcony, looking out over the city lights, I finally articulated the absolute truth of my journey, my final monologue. I looked back at the woman I was a year ago, fearful, manipulated, believing I had to earn my worth by enabling Max's grand, destructive ambitions. That woman is dead. And in her place, someone has been born who has understood a fundamental truth. Max's thesis line, that superiority is defined by gender and freedom from responsibility, was a poison used to justify theft. I had learned that true authority isn't snatched through coercion or justified by entitlement. It is earned through integrity and responsibility. Max claimed, he is man, so that's why he is superior and can snatch all the money, but he is not responsible for anything. I proved that my antithesis was the only thing that created lasting value. My worth is in the work and the integrity I uphold. I take responsibility for my life now. You, Max, are responsible for your own ruin. I am Sarah, and I am 51 years old. I have lost a brother, a mother's approval, and years of my life to a toxic lie. But in fighting for mother's dignity and my own survival, I did the most important thing I could have done. I finally claimed my self-worth. I learned that freedom is never too expensive, and the most important person I have to protect is the one who is invisible for 50 years, myself. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Voice of Jenna so you never miss the next chapter in our world of twists, lessons, and unforgettable moments. Your support means the world to me, and trust me, the stories only get better from here.